right, I'm just going to get started with introductions. So I'm Patrick Arlt. I work on the ArcGIS for Developers website as a designer and developer. And for the last couple of years, I've been running this session, which is CSS for Geographers, and it's a little bit of a play. Myself and some of the other people doing developer outreach kind of thought that maybe there was an audience that was being underserved at the Dev Summit. There wasn't quite enough introductory material. People might be going into sessions not knowing a lot about web development. So we came up with this idea that if you were a geographer who mistakenly had been sent here, we could bring you up to speed a little bit. And we started doing it with this talk. We have JavaScript for Geographers tomorrow. That's the URL for the slides. I'll put that up again at the end if you don't get it, and I'll leave it up for as long as I can. So like I said, this talk is basics. There's nothing fancy, there's no tools, there's not a lot of terminology. The goal is to give you a foundation to go forward learning about CSS and just talking through some of the finer points of things about it. And all of the links in this are practical. They're all links to online code playgrounds, so you can actually go in and mess around with the code for all these demos right away. And there's also lots of links that I'm not going to go to in the talk, which are resources that I think are really good and authoritative to learn about each of the topics I'm going to cover. So grab the slide URL at the end, and you can actually take advantage of all the resources that I put together for you instead of having to search out something on your own. So CSS is one of those interesting things. There's a lot of discussion on, is CSS a programming language? Is it a language for styling? Some people think CSS is super easy. Some people think CSS is super hard. I think database design is hard. I think scaling, thousands of servers is really hard. Some people think CSS is hard kind of in that exact same way. It's a lot less relative. It's very, very kind of relative to the viewer, but it's relative to kind of your experience. And it's a lot closer to kind of art and design than it is to some hard and fast computer science rules that you can learn, or that there's no one way to optimize it or perfect answers. And it takes a long time to kind of learn the concepts and to kind of get that level of mastery to really feel confident with it, because you're fussing around a lot. And things have gotten a lot easier, but they've also gotten a little trickier because there's more stuff to learn now. But once you start getting into the basics, you can actually do quite a lot of things. All of the Esri story maps, for example, are just downloadable. So once you download them to your machine, you can actually just go in and start customizing the CSS on your own. Customize the fonts, customize the layouts, things like that. It actually becomes really, really easy to customize those apps. You can do things like make frameworks for your web pages. You can build your own web pages. You can use it to restyle your application. So there's lots of stuff that you can do once you kind of get those basic concepts down. So CSS, there's generally one of three ways that you're going to bring CSS into a web page. You're going to put it inside a style tag in your HTML. Then you can just write CSS inside that style tag. Or you can include it in a separate file via a link tag. And the link tag usually looks like link href equals and then the URL to your file, and then rel style sheet type text CSS. So that's just, you can just copy that out of slides. I don't actually remember what all that is every time I need one. And you put that link tag in the head tag of your HTML file. And then that references the external file and brings it into your web page and then applies the styling. So if you've been attending Dev Summit for any length of time and you've seen any JavaScript demo, if you caught it, you probably saw this. This is the shortest possible way to make a map cover the entire web page. It's 5 lines of CSS. And the different parts of it are this. So there's a selector, and every CSS rule has a selector. And the selector actually selects elements on the HTML page to apply the styles to. In this case, we're selecting 3 elements on the web page. We're selecting the HTML tag, we're selecting the body tag, and we're selecting the element that has an ID of map. That's what the hashtag is kind of the shorthand for. So then you get a pair of curly braces. The curly braces define the declaration of the CSS rules that you're going to apply to those elements. And then you have a property. There's a lot of different CSS properties. We're going to just do a real basic one. That's margin. So we want to tell all of these elements that the margin is 0. And that essentially resets any margin that they might already have. So it eliminates the space between that element and all the other elements around it. We do another property. We want the width of those 3 elements to be 100%, and then we want the height of those elements to also be 100%. And that makes all of those elements cover the entire page, and then your map covers the entire page. Taken together, all of these things are a single CSS rule, and you might have 10 or 20 of these, or you might have thousands of these across a single page. So when you have thousands of these rules across a single page, styling buttons and your layout and your text and everything else, how does it actually work on the page? What determines which styles get applied to which elements? And that's where the C in CSS comes in. It stands for cascading. And the reason that it stands for cascading, what that means is that the styles applied to the elements accumulate as you apply all the different styles. And then a final style is computed from taking all of those CSS rules and combining them together. So it might look like this. The browser by default has a CSS style sheet. It says that paragraphs are always Times New Roman, and the basic font size is always 16 pixels, and inputs have a light gray border, and all the basic stuff that you would normally see. Links are blue, links you visited are purple. We've all kind of seen this. And then on top of that, you can define your own style sheets, the style sheets that you bring in with link, and those defines more styles. And then there might be style tags on the page, and those add more styles. And then there's styles that you write inline, like div style equals background red. More styles come in. And then finally, the last part of the cascade is anytime you use the CSS value with important, it applies that rule over the top of everything else. And all of those rules combine, and then they're selected and assigned a specificity. So whichever rule, so if I have 2 rules and one says the text should be blue and one says the text should be pink, one of those rules has to win. The text can't be blue and pink. It has to be one or the other. And that's determined by the specificity of the selectors. So the more specific you are with targeting a particular rule, the more chance that rule has of being applied. So it works kind of in this way. Anything with important wins. It's just done at that point. Anything that you apply on the actual element, div style background red, that wins in that case. Then anything in a style or a link tag, and then in that case it goes by selector specificity. So the selector that's the most specific usually wins. And selector specificity usually goes like this. Anything with an ID wins. Then anything with a class, and then anything with a tag. So these are kind of how they look in your CSS. So hashtag foo would apply to div ID foo, dot foo would apply to div class foo, or you can just use div. And there's a handy website, which I really like, called CSS Explain. And it lets you type in any CSS selector, and it shows you how specific it is. So in this case, div has a really good specificity. It comes in as green because I specified it as an ID. And if I do dot foo, it's still pretty good, but it's not great. But it's still probably specific enough to get what I want. But if I want to style all paragraph tags on my entire page, that's still not bad. But you can start to gauge which selectors are more specific. For example, li plain a, not super great. Like that's kind of a weird selector anyway. But it's going to select all anchor tags on the page first, give me every anchor tag, and then find all the anchor tags that are inside of list items that have a class of plain. There's lots of chances for that to be overwritten by other things. So in case you end up with a tie, which actually happens a lot more than you would think, the last rule that was placed on the page wins. So that's your tiebreaker. So I want to go and I want to actually mess around with this a little bit. So I found a story map, and if you're in any browser, you can actually just right-click and hit inspect, and it'll open up. This is going to get a little tight. There we go. and it'll open up the developer tools, and you can actually poke around at the web page inside the developer tools. This is a really good way to start actually messing around with CSS. So in this case, I right-clicked on the H1, and I can see that I can highlight over the H1. I can see that it has a class of cover title, title text, text dark, and it's containing the text very large art. And I can look down in the styles panel and see the styles that are being applied to it. So we'll find this one. So the color property, the color that defines that this is black, is coming from foreground title text, text dark. And we can see that there's also this text shadow rule, but it's actually being overwritten by another rule that's up here. So you can toggle rules on or off to actually add behavior. So if I toggle the text shadow rule off from this one, you can see that it then adds this white text shadow around there. It's really subtle. You probably can't see that. But then you can also go edit the rule. So if you double click on a rule, you can edit it. So if I want this to be red, we can then make the title text red. And you can actually start playing around with CSS on the page. I do this all the time. I usually do this before I apply actual style, go into my editor and apply styles. I will oftentimes just write styles directly in here, because you can do things like this. You can just click on element style and then add. Let's do. And you can just add styles you want into there that don't even bother existing yet. So for example, I just made the text uppercase. So you can actually dig in and mess around with your existing applications and figure out ways that you might want to make them better. And it's a good way to actually learn about CSS and see how the rules are actually being applied in the browser. So what are we going to do today? We've got kind of some basic fundamentals and we know what we're doing. So we're going to build a really, really simple app from scratch. And the reason I do the exercise this way is there's a lot that goes into building an app like this, but it's also, when you get to the end of it, there's probably only about 50 lines of CSS in this entire app. And it really shows what you can do if you pay attention to some of the fundamentals that I just showed you, like paying attention to how things cascade and knowing how to smartly apply properties and only kind of doing what you need. So the first demo I want to show is I want to show you the concept about elements are either blocks or they're inline. And the difference between block and inline elements is this. I'm actually going to close some of my other demos. So all of those yellow links, those are all links to these demos, so you can actually get to these demos and play around with them. Block elements are the elements that you're generally going to use to define your layout. Block elements are always going to expand. They're like the gas of CSS. They expand to fill all the available width that they can. And their height generally expands to contain all of their content. So as you add content to a block element, it slowly gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And you can also specify widths and heights for them. So for example, this I have width class, I can try to get this a little bit bigger. So for example, this I have width class is applied to this I have width block down here, which is over here, and I can make that, if I want that to be 250 pixels wide, you can see it got a little bit wider. And they can also have height. So for example, this one is 100 pixels high, so I can make it, say, 260 pixels high. Needs a unit pixels. And you can see it got quite a bit higher. So that's block elements. Inline elements are what you're going to use for text. And they flow like text flows. So they appear next to each other depending on the document that you're looking at. If you're looking at a document in a right to left language, they actually flow right to left. If you're looking at something in English, which is left to right, they flow left to right. But even though they have this general kind of text flow, you can still do quite a lot with them. You can give them backgrounds, you can give them borders, padding, things like that. So they're pretty flexible and you're going to use them a lot. If I pull this around, they're also subject to vertical align, so you can do things like supertext, subtext, things like that. So you notice that I was inputting pixels a whole lot. We were using pixels. There's actually lots of different units that you can use in CSS. Pixels are probably the most common, and they're the easiest to use because it just is how we know to experience computers. So I have a couple boxes here. So pixels is easy. 250 pixels is about 250 pixels on my screen, so it looks like that. But there's also percentages. So I have a box here that's 25% wide and 25% high. And that's based on the size of its parent. So if the parent of this thing is a block element, and block elements expand to fill the width of their container, this is going to be 25% the width of the container, which is great. But the height one doesn't work too well here. And that's because it's relative to the container. How tall is this container? Well, I don't know. The browser knows, but should the browser pick 25% the height of a container that it doesn't really know the relationship of anyway? They could be any height. It's really hard to figure out. So the browser tends to just ignore height properties quite a bit, unless its parent has a specific height that it wants to be. So there's also some other units. There's also ems and rems, and this is actually digs into some very esoteric history of how typography works. If you set type on a letterpress, there's actually an M unit in letterpress typography from, a long time ago, and that is the width of the character M in whatever font you're using. And CSS actually has that as well. One M is generally going to be about one character. So this box is going to be roughly maybe 10-ish by 10-ish characters. CSS makes this extra complicated by making M's compound each other. So if I have something that's 2 M's inside of something that's 10 M's, it's now something like 20 M's. And that is absolutely ridiculous and totally impossible to keep track of, and it's why no one uses M's. Instead, everyone uses rems, which stands for root M, which is the size of the font at the body. So this box is 10 rems by 10 rems. And if you notice up here, my body font is 16 pixels. So it's going to be 10 times 160 pixels. So the box is about 160 pixels by 160 pixels. If I change this, let's not make it 240 pixels. That would be a little insane. Let's make it a 24. That box is going to get a whole lot larger. You can see now it kind of wrapped a little bit. So that's one of the ways that you can actually use to kind of influence your sizing, and that's relative to something else that you can control. So it's a good way to size things relative to text rather than relative to something else. And now I have to set that back down because I just broke all my demos. So the last two that I use a lot on the developer site, and I generally have started using quite a bit, are VH and VW. And those are relative to the width and height of the browser window. And this is really cool when you're doing design that needs to work across lots of different screen sizes, like it needs to work on a phone and in a back office. So this box here is 25 VH by 25 VH. So it's relative to the height of the container. So it's 25% of this height. And this one is the same, but it's 20% wide. So if I make this wider, you'll notice that that box is actually getting bigger as I make my screen wider. And if I make it really small, that actually starts to shrink. That's pretty neat because it allows you to size things relative to the area of the user's screen. And you can do all sorts of fun things like that. If the developer site will load quickly on the demo network, and if I reduce the size just a little bit, notice that no matter what really my font size is, the text at the very bottom is always slightly cut off, no matter what. It's almost always cut off right in the middle. And we do that for a couple of reasons, because we want to encourage people to scroll down the page, and putting something that's cut off right on the page encourages users to scroll a little. And we size that no matter what, because we know the height of your browser window is always going to be 100 VH, and we always know how high this bar is going to be, and we can calculate that to create the effect we want to. So it's a fun little effect. So those are just a quick overview of some units. So now we've got some basic foundations. We have some units, and we know what block is, and we know what inline is. So we need to talk about everyone's least favorite CSS topic ever, which is floats. And floats were kind of the first thing in CSS that people started to subvert to do layout with. Before then, everything just got shoved into an HTML table, and it was a mess, because whenever you wanted to change where something was on the page, you didn't go to CSS, you went to your HTML, and you just copy and pasted things all over your application. Floats were designed not to do that, but instead to float images to the left or right of text. Like when you're reading a book and you see text kind of wrapping around an image, that was the original intent of floats. Until people started to subvert them to do things like this, where say I wanted a map div, this is the blue div on the side, I want to float that to the right, so it picks up the div and it moves it to the right side of its container. We'll give it a background, we'll give it a width, we'll give it a height. And then we want to have a sidebar for our application. We're just building a typical mapping application, so we pick it up, we float it to the left, we have it be 30% the width and 100% the height. And that works great. Like, that looks fine. That's totally acceptable right there. Except then you get to the unpleasant part. Because we also wanted to add a footer. Except our footer has a pink background, and our footer doesn't have a pink background. Where is our pink background? Our pink background is behind our sidebar right here. It's behind the sidebar in the map because we picked up the map and the sidebar and we put them on the left and we put them on the right, and then the footer said, hey, I can go all the way up here because there's nothing blocking my way. It removed the sidebar and the map from the flow of the document, which is really kind of inconvenient for us. So much has been discussed on actually kind of dealing with this, and the solution is to do something called clearing floats, which is more problematic. So there's another property you can add, which is clear, and that says, hey, if something has been floated above or below me, I need to go below that. And in this case, we're using clear both, which says I want this to go below anything that's been floated on the right or the left. And then you can see now that our footer has the pink background because it's always going to clear the float from the right or the left. Now, doing that for every element on every page ended up being a huge pain. So people started coming up with something called clearfix to just fix this everywhere. And you'll see lots of ways to clearfix. There's one in particular that I will show where we make a class clearfix. And we use a special selector called after, which puts in a temporary HTML element, and we give that clear both. And then if you apply that to the container, it'll automatically clear the floats for you. So you will oftentimes, if you're digging around a web page, you'll see tons and tons of references to clearfix classes or CF classes or something. And that's to basically just get around this singular issue of floats. Because for a long time, floats were all we had. For years and years and years, all we had to do layouts with was floats. It was terrible. So we'll come back to layout in a little bit later, but I want to talk about the box model now. So this is another concept that you'd use a lot when you're working through this. So we'll continue our little demo. So I wanted my sidebar to have a little bit of padding. I wanted to set the text off from whatever was around it, so I added some padding to the right of it. And if I inspect this, you see my sidebar there, and you can look down here, my sidebar is 57.112 pixels wide, and it's got 16 pixels of padding on the right side. And that's defined by this rule over here, padding right 1 rem. 1 rem is 16 pixels. And that works, except for the fact that it really unfortunately bumped my map down now, which is kind of annoying, because it added the 16 pixels to the existing 25% wide. So now it's 30% wide plus 1 rem, and my map is 70% wide, so now my entire width adds up to more than 100, so it decides I'm going to move this to the next line. This is equally annoying, and another reason why people really hated CSS for a long time until we got a solution to it, which is called box sizing. And with box sizing, what we can do is we can tell CSS how we want it to calculate the width of things. Because right now, width is relative to this inner measurement. And then padding and borders and margins are all added outside of that. So you're adding to the width that way. But if we change how CSS interprets the box model, we can say box sizing border box. And if we inspect that now, the layout works, and there's padding all the way around this now. And 25% wide is now relative to the edge of the border rather than the edge of the content, which is really nice for us. We use box sizing all over the place. The two things you really need to worry about is you really just need to worry about border box when you want your width to include your margins or your padding and your borders. So that's one of those. You can play around with that too. And this is the way things worked for several years in CSS, and we still use them today, and we do lots of stuff with floats and clear fixes and box sizing and things like that. But a couple of years ago, things started to change. We finally got a real tool that was kind of designed to help us actually lay out web pages. And this was like 2009. Like, we weren't actually getting things in CSS to lay out web pages until very, very recently. We were basically just hacking things that had been added for other purposes until we got Flexbox. And Flexbox was a new way of thinking about how to lay out block elements. So with Flexbox, there's a new display property. Things are no longer just block or inline. They can also be flex. And what flex does is it turns all of the children of body. Every element under body becomes a flex child, and you can tell them to flex in different ways, to grow and to shrink relative to each other. So if you look at my HTML, I've got a body tag, and then I have a header, and then I have a wrapper, and then I have a footer. And inside the wrapper, I have a sidebar and I have a map. So we're going to tell the body to display flex, and that turns the wrapper, the header, and the footer, which are the children of my body, into flex elements. And I want to flex them in columns. I want to tell them you're going to work like a column. So flex items now stack like a column, so they go left to right. And for my wrapper, you can define how you want the wrappers and things to flex. So I'm going to use the shorthand property, which is flex. And I'm going to say flex 1, 1 auto. And that's actually shorthand for grow, shrink, and basis, which is where it starts at. So by default, this item grows at a rate of 1 relative to all the other items in the flex. And it shrinks at a rate of 1 relative to all the items in the flex. And it also just starts with width of auto. And since elements expand to fill their width, that automatically expands to fill the remaining width. And then inside of wrapper, we're going to also make children of wrapper flex items, but we want them to flex like rows. So we want them to be arranged vertically instead. And then this is our sidebar. So our sidebar, we also want 1, 1 auto. And then our map has 2, 1 auto. So our map is going to grow at twice the rate of our sidebar, meaning it's always going to be twice as wide. And that's really helpful, so you can actually control how these things kind of move relative to each other. And our header and our footer don't flex at all. We don't want them to grow or shrink. We want them to always be as small as they possibly can to contain the content that's inside them. That's why they're exactly the same height as the text inside of them. So we got Flexbox, and if you want, I'll point out specifically the first link here. This is actually how I learned Flexbox. It's a game. It's like Frogger, but you have to move the frog across the street with Flexbox, and it's hilarious, and it takes a long time. It's really easy for like the first 20 levels, and then it's impossible. But there's lots of other resources. That one's just particularly fun because it's a game. But there are still issues with this because we can only control boxes in one row or one column at a time, which is just, it still wasn't quite enough until we finally got CSS Grid. And this is the first year I've talked about CSS Grid. This is the first thing in CSS in the specification ever that's actually for laying out web pages, which seems insane because CSS has been around forever, and we haven't ever gotten anything that was specifically designed for laying out a web page. So when you're starting with CSS Grid, and it seems like vaguely magical at the beginning, Grid organizes a container element into tracks and rows. So we say our body. So now if you look here, I dispensed with the wrapper div. So I just have 4 divs, header, sidebar, map, and footer. And we're going to divide those up into our application. So I have a display grid. And I have 2 columns in my grid. One column is 33% wide, and one column is 66% wide. And then I have 3 rows in my grid. Min content, min max auto 100 VH, and min content. And these are special terms that were introduced along with grid. And min content says This row is however small it needs to be to accommodate its content. It's fine. Just make it as small as possible without scrolling anything. And the min-max is another one. It says, make this either as small as auto or as big as 100 VH. So either make this thing as small as you can or as big as you can. And then we want our footer to be min content, so our footer is as small as it can. And the grid just sort of figures this out and divides that body up into these areas. So now I have 6 areas that I can work with. And you can actually see this if I zoom the inspector out a little more. So if I hover over the body, you can actually see the browser helpfully, if I hover over body, it divides that up into those grid areas for me. So I can see that I have 2 rows and I have 3 rows and 2 columns, and I can assign divs to exist in a certain number of rows and columns, which is what we do next. I'll make that a little larger. So once I've got my rows and columns defined, I can actually start to assign things to them. So we'll start at the header because that's easy. My header is going to start at my first column. And it's going to end at my second column. The row is automatically set to 1, so we don't need to specify row. So it literally just says, now that you've got this grid of 6 things, just start it here and end it here, and you're done. Which is awesome. Footer is the same way. We're just going to define it using the shorthand. I want my footer to start at the 3rd row and the 1st column, and then I want it to span 2 rows. So, and then you can actually just keep going. So for our sidebar, I want it to start at the 1st column and the 2nd row, and then keep going. For our map, I want it to start at the 2nd row and the 2nd column. So this actually just takes those things, assigns them where you want them exactly in the grid of 6 things. And if this isn't making total sense to you, it's okay, because it actually took me like an hour and a half to put together this demo because I was struggling against most of it. There is a bonus demo for actually making this a whole lot easier, though, and that's using template areas. So now we have a 3rd property, and the 3rd property names each cell that we're going to create in our grid. So if I have 2 columns and 3 rows, I'm going to put 3 strings, and each string is going to represent a row, and each space-separated item is going to represent a column. This is literally magic. Header, header, sidebar, map, footer, footer. That literally looks like what we're looking at on the output side of things. And then instead of having to remember how many columns or rows I have in my grid, I just say, look, the sidebar goes in the sidebar. It's fine. Just put it there. Right? Like this is absolutely insanity for someone who's been working with CSS for any length of time. And you can actually use this in almost every browser now. The map goes where the map goes, the header goes where the header goes, and the footer goes where the footer goes, and our whole layout is done. This is the smallest layout demo in this whole presentation. And it's also the most intuitive. I know exactly where everything goes. If I want my sidebar to go up here, I can just put it up there. You know, and then break my whole layout. It's fine. That's literally what CSS is for. So this is very, very, very new. CSS Grid is very new, but it's well supported in almost every browser. I believe we're missing IE 11 at this point. And there is a flag that you can use to check whether the browser supports Grid or not, and then you can fall back to a simpler layout for browsers that don't support it. There's also, I'll point out, Grid Garden is really cool. It's the same people who made Flexbox Frogger. It's now a garden that you have to water with CSS Grid. It's also very fun. I played the first 10 levels. There were 20-something. Very, very fun. Play it on the plane ride home. So that's kind of basic page layout, right? We saw the evolution from floats and clears to Flexbox to CSS Grid, and we were able to make some basic application layouts. So now we want to kind of refine it a little bit more. And that's where margins and padding come in. So in this one, the only thing that's different in this demo is we've added 1 rem of padding to the sidebar. We want the content in the sidebar to stand off a little bit from its area around it. And you can see that that's reflected over here. The sidebar now kind of sits inside. We're padding that area. And padding always includes the background color. Margin, however, which is what we did with the map, does not have the background color. You can see that the blue background of the map is now about 1 rem away from its border, and the background, the beige of the body, is now showing through that. And then I also gave some borders here. So for example, there's a bottom border on the header, a top border on the footer, and a border on the right of the sidebar. So just some little things you can kind of use to kind of set the app off a little bit, assign borders to things. You can target specific sides at specific thicknesses, all sorts of things like that. So then one of the last things that we're doing, we're starting to actually, believe it or not, we're probably like 2 or 3 steps away from having that little demo app look like the app I showed at the beginning. And one of the things we need to do is we need to actually make there be 2 layouts. We need to have a layout for when you're looking at it on a larger screen and a layout for when you're looking at it on a smaller screen. And we do that with a CSS feature called MediaQueries. And a MediaQuery allows you to write special CSS that applies when certain conditions are met. So for example, I want to apply this CSS when the media is screen and the maximum width of my screen is 768 pixels or less. That's about like an iPad in portrait mode or so. So you can see if I actually take this, I'm going to have to reduce the font size. If I take this, we can actually see that the layout changes. And you can see that right there, there's 776, there's 768. So you can see right there, it applies additional CSS. And this is where the cascading rules and the the selector specificity really comes in handy, because I only have to target a couple of rules to override. And even though they have the same selectors, for example, here's sidebar and here's sidebar, the rule that was added last wins. And this rule is later than the rule above it, so that gets order 2. And that's a flexbox property that says, put this in the 2nd position in the flexbox. And then the map we put in order 1, so it flips the order of the map and the sidebar when we're on a mobile device. It also makes the map 100% wide by telling it to expand, fill up the whole area. And it flips the wrapper div to column so that it actually now flows left to right. So that's a really basic media query. Usually you'll do something like the screen and max width combination when you want to target smaller devices. There's lots of other ones. You can do things like target retina displays, target displays that only have black and white colors. You can actually target print. If you do @media print, you can apply CSS only when a user prints something. So you can use that to maybe hide your UI or hide your background. If you're doing a page with a dark layout, a lot of times I will apply @print rules to inverse the color of the page so that when someone prints the page, they're not printing a black background, which uses up all your ink. So we're almost done here, right? We've got this kind of split layout. We've got an area for all the areas laid out for all of our content. And now we need to position a few controls, like things like zoom buttons and search and things like that. And you can do this with the concept of position. So I've added a couple things here, right? We have our map div, and then we have some controls, top left, top right, bottom right. And we've added a few things to our map. So our controls are all positioned absolutely, and there's different ways, different models that CSS uses to position things. The most useful one, I think, is absolute. And that says position this control relative to the nearest thing to it that has some kind of positioning. So in this case, that's our map, and our map is positioned relative. So it'll position these elements in absolute terms to the map. And you can see that that's actually pretty easy to control. For example, if it has top, it's always going to be 10 pixels away from the top. If I change this, I can say 20 pixels, and those will move down a little bit. So it's very easy to target things. I want this in the bottom left or the top right or whatever, and it's relative to that. And I always like to do this exercise. At this point, who knows what will happen if I define top, left, bottom, and right? This is like bonus points. So if I define top, it's 20 pixels away from the top. But what happens when I define top and bottom? It actually works both ways, because I can say bottom 10 pixels, and it now positions those 20 pixels away from the top and 10 pixels away from the bottom. This is my most fun demo, because it's like now we can also add right 0 and left 0. And now all of our controls take up the entire space. Because it's doing exactly what I told it to do. I want this thing to be 20 pixels away from the top, 10 pixels away from the bottom, and 0 pixels away from the right and the left. It's fun, and it has very few practical applications, but it shows you kind of how this works. You have a relative parent, and then you position things absolute to that relative parent. So it's a common technique. This is how the JavaScript API defines all the UI areas and everything. So the next demos will go pretty quick. I do have sections on this. These are almost talks in and of themselves, things like about typography. There are the easiest way to get some high quality typography in your app. Google Fonts APIs, those are extremely useful. They give you copy and paste code. There's hundreds of available fonts. You just go there, you pick the fonts you want, and they give you a link tag. And you drop the link tag into your app, and that loads the font, and then they also give you the corresponding CSS to use for it. So for example, I picked, what did I pick? I picked Quattrocento and Oswald. And you can see I'm applying those here. So I have a link that loads the fonts, and I have a font family property that says use Quattrocento for the body, which then inherits down to everything else, and use Oswald for all of the headers. And we can see we're starting to build the app out a little bit there. There's some good links in this section, particularly the Google Web Fonts typographic project. This is actually someone who's went through and they've made good font pairings for fonts that are free on Google Fonts API. So you can actually just go, if you just don't know what you're picking, at least someone's made some good choices for you and you can kind of pick what's appropriate. There's also some other tools that do similar things, but this is, in general, it's a good way to just quickly get some fonts going in your project. So next we're going to start worrying about sizing. And if I actually, there we go. So you can kind of see that I've started to apply some sizing here. We've got some text in there. So, and you can see that I've kind of sized things a little differently. The headers are kind of different. The header of the application is different. The body text is different. And we're doing all of that with the rem unit that I mentioned earlier. So you can see this. Stop that right there. So you can see this. I'm styling H1, H2, H3, and H4, and they've all got different units of size relative to my body. And then I'm also styling smalls and font smalls kind of smaller than my standard body copy. And those values are from this link right here that's called Typescale. And this actually applies some very classic typographic sizing stuff that comes out of bookmaking and letterpress and things like that to your project. And you just kind of pick a size that you want your project to be and how big you want your headers to be relative to that size. And it just spits out kind of the appropriate CSS for you. So if I want my size to be 24, I can choose a scale, and you can see it kind of adjusts that, and I can just grab the CSS. And it actually spits out the CSS for me to use this right here. So it's a quick way to just kind of size everything really quickly, and it tends to look really, really good, and it's very fast. So next, we'll talk about color. This is actually, all of these links are basically just different tools for helping kind of pick reasonable looking color schemes for apps. The flat UI color is what's added in this demo. So we have kind of the blue background on the icy blue foreground. And those are defined as hex colors. CSS finally supports more than just hex colors. Generally, you only need hex colors, and they're kind of supported everywhere. But you can define background colors, border colors, things like that. And there's some good tools here. These are from Flat UI, which tends to have a lot of very bold color schemes. That looks like it's going to be slow on the network. So, and then finally we can add JavaScript, right? We're finally kind of done with this, and I have that in full screen. So this is actually the final demo. That's the CSS that we kind of built up over the whole course of the session. So we've got the responsive design, we've got the fonts, the colors, we've got the layout. This area scrolls. and things like that. If I start bumping the font size up, this will kind of simulate that I'm on a smaller device, and then we can see that on a smaller screen, this would actually flip over, and it would do kind of a phone UI. So collectively, though, that's not very much CSS. This is the entirety of the CSS for the whole project. It's probably about 200 lines or so, just for this one project. So it's possible to get something that's really, really good without touching a framework, without worrying about Bootstrap or CalSite or any of the tools or any command line things or anything. Just write some basic CSS, use the principles, and you can actually produce things that are well styled right out of the gate very, very fast and very easily without worrying about it a lot. So I will talk about browser compatibility real quick. This has gotten a lot better as browsers have went on. Most browsers, when they implement something kind of experimental, they'll tend to prefix it. So you'll see a lot of sites that might have, WebKit Flex and Moz Flex and MS Flex. That's just the prefix that those browsers are experimenting with implementing something under. And then you can use sites that I have 2 links there. Sites like Can I Use will tell you if you can use a particular CSS feature in a specific browser. There are other tools like Auto Prefixer. You can just paste things into Auto Prefixer and it'll automatically try to make your CSS as compatible as possible. There's also a new thing which is @supports. @supports was introduced along with CSS Grid. So you can actually check if certain CSS is supported in whatever browser you're in, and then you can define fallbacks if necessary. And if a browser doesn't support @supports, it's always false. So even browsers that don't support @supports still can use @supports just by omission, which is kind of fun. Remember, so this is my little plug here. Microsoft only supports Internet Explorer 11. If you're not using at least Internet Explorer 11 in your organization, you're not getting security patches from Microsoft. This isn't just me being a designer who wants to use the latest features. You are insecure if you're using IE10. Go back, tell your IT people. The good news is that IE11 actually has a lot of good support for things, like it supports Flexbox and lots of other fun features. It does not support Grid, but because of @supports, you can define fallbacks. I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to skip the last slide. You can reference it on your own. But in general, that is a quick introduction to CSS. I'm going to leave this up for the duration of questions, and you can grab the link to the slides. That has all the links to everything else. Please leave me a review. It's in the app. Just search for CSS for Geographers. And that's it. I have almost the full 15 minutes for questions if anyone would like to ask anything right now. So, any questions? No? We're good. All right. I will hang around up here for about another 10 or 15 minutes if anyone would like to come up and ask something. Thank you.